Okay guys, I'm back to do the second part of the video where we put this Tanfoglio pistol back together. We're going to start with the top end. Let's put the extractor and the extractor spring back in, and we will need the pin that goes with that, which is that one. Alright, so the spring basically just drops into the hole provided for it. It bottoms out against the slide body like that, and the extractor just drops in. Drop it in front first and drop the back end in afterwards. Now you're going to need to put some pressure on the front of it to push it back into the slot, and inward pressure to push it in under spring tension so that the hole lines up with the frame, so you can get a pin through there. Some people use a slave pin in there. I don't. Like I said, I like to feel what's going on when I'm knocking the pin in. So let's just get that pin started, and let's put the pressure on the extractor, and that went perfect. First go, I drive my pins in past where they need to be, and then I turn over, and that just deburrs them around the edge, and I turn it over and set it to the correct depth. That's perfect. Just test that tension on the extractor, make sure it's there and there's nothing preventing its movement. Beautiful. No lubrication on those parts, just goes in like that. Now for the firing pin spring, the firing pin block, and the firing pin stop plate or retainer. This is the firing pin block. It's got a slot cut into it on one side, and the other side is cylindrical, and there's the little spring that lives in the bottom. I put a little bit of grease on that just to keep it in there so it doesn't fall out, and tiny bit of lube from my fingers on there, not a lot at all, because there is metal to metal contact. With the slide pointing towards you in the upside down position, you want to drop that in with the slot pointing towards the left. There we go. Just drops in like that, and there is spring tension there, which is great. Now it is a firing pin block, so you're not going to be able to get your spring in unless you press the block down to line up the hole with the slot, and there it's free for the pin to go, the spring to go in. With your firing pin, you want the slot that's cut into it pointing up towards you, and that should just go straight in like that. Again, press down on the block to allow the firing pin to go in. Hold it in with your finger, grab your firing pin stop plate and slide that in to hold the pin in. Careful you don't let go, otherwise that pin will get airborne. Push down on the firing pin and slide that stop into place, and it should just click when it locks in. The important thing to do now is to test that your firing pin actually works. So I'll press down on it and it protrudes nicely, it's clear, there's no friction. And the other important thing is to make sure that the firing pin block actually works. So by pressing down on the firing pin block and trying to activate the firing pin, it actually blocks its movement and it does not protrude from the breech face of the slide. That is working, and when you release it, it allows it to function correctly. Excellent. Let's put the barrel in. A little bit of lube on the lugs, just a line over each lug, a little bit in there where the slide stop runs, and on the cone. Just lubricate that area, drop it in, and with just the lube that's left on your fingers, you can lubricate the guide rod and the recoil spring and the plug, and drop that all in one go like that. Compress the spring and put it in position, and that's our top end done, finished. Now with our frame, the bottom end of the gun, the last part we took out was the mag release. And in the mag release we have a tiny little spring and plunger. Now we're going to need to compress that plunger whilst putting pressure down with the guide for the trigger, which is this guy. Putting pressure down in that area there, and as we pull out our punch, we want the foot of this to fall in there and have the plunger putting pressure on the side. That's what holds the mag release in, and that's what gives the spring tension to the guide for your trigger. So let's make sure that spring is in there with the plunger. This has been magnetized now, so it's wanting to pull it out. Let's get a different punch. There we go. Drop that into your frame, just like that. And it doesn't matter at this stage which way that foot is facing, because you can always turn it around once it's in position. So just drop it in the hole from the top of the frame, and with your punch you want to put pressure and push that plunger in. You can see there's spring tension there. I want to push it all the way in and push down on the guide, and at the same time pull the punch out. I'm going to swap fingers here. Pull that out, and did you hear that? It's slotted straight in. Now we can turn it around so it faces the correct direction, which is away from you. The foot should face away from you. i.e. downrange. And just to test that everything's working, there's tension on the mag release, there's tension on the foot of the plunger for the trigger guide, and nothing's falling out, so it's worked correctly as it should. The next step is to install the trigger. Now before we put the trigger in, I want to show you the trigger return spring. Now this is the guy that causes a lot of problems for people. As you see, it has a long leg and a short leg. We're going to be positioning that long leg into the slot provided in the bottom of the frame. Right there, there's a slot for it. And the short leg of the spring will actually just go into the recess in the top of the trigger. There's just a hole in there. It's not a specific hole for it, but it's where it rests. It's a massive hole, so it doesn't really matter where it goes in there. We're going to be holding the spring in our weak hand with the long nose pliers quite tight, because what we're going to need to do, and just to show you, the long leg is on the left and the short leg is on the right. So the long leg's going to go into the slot on the frame, and the short leg's going to go into the recessed hole in the trigger. What we're actually going to be doing is we're going to be forcing it in there and putting pressure on the legs under tension to bend them open. This allows us to push this spring ring down so we can get the holes to line up and put the pin through. Right, before we do that, let's prepare the frame. Get your pin, put it in the frame and knock it in slightly. Make sure not to let it protrude into the frame. It must just be flush. There we go, that's flush. By doing this, you're free of one item. You don't need to worry about it. The next thing we're going to do is drop the trigger in, and because these were all cleaned, we just need a little bit of lube down the side of that trigger bar. Drop that in. It's a little bit tricky. There we go. Now you're going to have to push down on it to take up that spring pressure on the trigger guide, which we've just installed into the mag release. So push down on it and try and line up that hole with the trigger with the hole in the frame to get that pin in. The next step is to tap that pin in just so that it grabs the trigger. So we're into the frame and we're into the trigger, but we're not protruding. So now we don't have to worry about holding the trigger in position or lining up the pin. All we need to do is worry about getting the spring in now. So we're going to grab that spring in our long nose pliers with our weak hand. We're going to hold it quite tight without crushing the spring. And when we hit this pin in, we're going to hit it in as far as we can go without hitting the frame of the pistol. And it should go all the way through, almost into the other side without any problems. Remember, the long leg on the left, short leg on the right. And we're going to put it in and put pressure, downward pressure on it to spread those legs apart. That's looking good, and there's no rush. We can just keep it in there, put the firearm on the table, grab your hammer and tap that pin in. You can let go of it now, test your trigger, and it actually returns. All good. Now we can tap that pin all the way through and past where it needs to be, just to deburr the edge, and from the other side just line it up nicely. Trigger works, spring is in, great. Next, hammer spring. I like to coat this in some grease. It does a lot of work. Drop it into the hole provided for it in the frame, which is right there, and grab your hammer. This is your hammer strut, which needs to go inside that spring, and the interrupter or disconnector needs to go over the trigger bar. You will need to apply, let's make sure that's over the trigger bar, you will need to apply some pressure to the hammer, which is now slippery because of the grease, just to line up the holes. See, I'm pushing down on the hammer to take up that spring pressure, and you're looking for the biggest pin, which is the hammer pin, and you're just going to drop it into that hole. Just make sure it's lined up. There we go. Wiggle the hammer around slightly just to allow that pin to go all the way home. Our hammer pin, which is the smallest pin, and I seem to have misplaced it. There it is. The hammer pin retains the hammer pin in place. Just drop that down the side. There's a little slot for it there. I'll put a picture on the video. Just drop it in there. And push it home with a punch. There we go, it's in. And you can see it there, it's in position holding the hammer in. That's the hammer pin. Make sure your hammer works. Next job. Sear cage. Remember in the first video we had to lift that leg of the sear spring up and out of the slot onto the cage, which had another little slot in there to get it out the way so we could unlock the safety and pull it out. Well, now we just want to make sure that that leg of the spring is still up and on the left and on top of the cage so we can reinstall it. To reinstall the cage, drop it into position as close as you can to the hammer in a downward position like that. Push down on it and back. Pushing back and down should cock the hammer slightly, but not enough to put it into the half cock position. Just enough to stop at the back. And when it's flush at the back, it's in the correct position. Take your safety catch, drop it in the hole, and it should just click in like that. Make sure your safety works. Yes, and the first thing I do before I forget is to drop that spring, or the leg of the spring, back into its proper resting position to lock that safety in place. If you don't do that and you forget to do it, and you put the slide on, it'll be very graty, it'll damage your spring and mark the bottom of your slide. That is in position, that is working correctly. We can now reinstall our right hand safety, and I seem to be losing all my pins today. There it is. Just pop that safety on there and start the pin in it. And it's just a matter of gently tapping it to get it home. That's it. Done. Ambi safety in position. Next job, to put the two together. Slide straight onto the frame. Line up the two dots. And we're done. Completely reassembled. Thank you for your time. Cheers.